Welcome to the Operationalizing ChatGPT session. I have been in this space for a while, so when I looked at this title, it was quite interesting, and that's where I signed up. I have a few more people with me. I'll just get us started, and then we can get going on the discussion part. So this, first of all, I think you guys have must seen this before. So this is recorded in case if you're uncomfortable, just make sure. We have 4 folks. So I'm here. Jose was planning to be here as well, but there was a family emergency. Weizhu and Manash should be online. There's Manash. So I am a lead partner architect for Azure Machine Learning, or Azure OpenAI Studio that you saw. Jose is the one that brought prompt flow to you guys. So his team did that. Weizhu has worked with, so if you guys have seen the LORA session where it's the fine-tuning one, he's the main scientist in that area. And then Manash is our PM, who has brought the fine-tuning and some of the ONNX and other science advancements to the group. So, and Weizhu is there online as well. Alrighty, so let's get started. I think in person, if you're in person asking the question, then raise your hand. And then if you're online, then submit a chat question. And I think we'll be able to monitor both. Let's see. So the topics that, based on our expertise, we were thinking that operationalizing large language models, prompt engineering, and then fine-tuning, those are some of the areas. But other than that, it's an open field. So whatever is on your mind. Let's see. I don't think I need any filler slides at this point. So let's get started. One thing I was hoping is when you ask a question or discussion point, share the name of your company or domain so that we know kind of in which space you guys are thinking about. Does that sound good? Alrighty. So we can get started with the discussion. Who would like to go first? There was some fun conversation at this table before we started around the structured data and what are the things that we might not need in the future. One of the things I'm really hoping for is all of these detailed workflows where no matter which website you go to, you have to remember how to get to a certain place. I hope that more and more you just ask your question and it takes you to the right page, because it's pretty hard to remember. Go ahead.
Sure. Can everybody hear me?
And I'll repeat the question.
Excellent. My name is Alexander Colabosa. I work with Teradata. And I feel a good starter for at least the personalization approach is to ask you about how you envision the transition, the same way that we transition from a more conventional way, okay, of building workflows and serving our customers, all right? By now offering them the option of using LLMs or the capabilities such as Copilot or so to create these new workflows. How do you envision these workflows being put into production and being sustained within the same framework if possible? This is something that I just have not happened to hear, and I'd be curious if Microsoft has also ideas and a vision about what happens after models are being productionized.
Yeah, it has been on the top of the mind for the team as well. Like if you saw last year, MLOps was the state of the art. That is how cutting edge we got. But more and more into model monitoring is where it's going. And so in terms of both the relevancy of the models, so the drifts, and any other reason it might have become stale and it better be refreshed soon. So that space now is something that's people are thinking about as well. Like going through it from standard side, so ML flow, is something that model monitoring would leverage, but not as many standards other than that yet. I think the embedding store is becoming mature, and that would give a lot of reuse. And so that's some space where the the credibility of that data would be the first problem. And then after that, there's all of these pipelines that will get built. Yeah, go ahead.
Shawndell from Boeing. So my question is, today we spend a lot of time building data warehouse, data lakes, and so on and so forth, right? Such level of data. And then on top of that, we do data analysis. But the large language model works completely differently from that. So do you see the large language model approach is going to replace that?
So the question was, would large language models replace data lakes kind of effort completely? I don't think so, not yet. So even if you saw Satya's keynote yesterday, both data is very important to these models right now. Like for OpenAI models, it comes in 3 stages. The first one is just public data, and then there's a whole bunch of hand-curated data that actually make them as smart as they are right now. Like credible sources of data is very important. Models learn syntax, like we were talking about earlier. They were nowhere close to semantics. So I hope they don't learn that just quite yet, because the thing is they don't know when they go into Neverland, and so good amount of good clean data is very important. But it can learn grammar though. So I think you don't want to spend time teaching it verb and noun and the basic structures of that data. So you could derive the schema out of the data probably, but not the actual content of it, not the facts.
Just augmenting the area that he was talking about, right, which is data modeling, data structures, and warehouses. You see a direct correlation between like getting the summary. Like some of the things that we do today is we have data cataloging, right? Tools that go look at your metadata and figure out what's the business context, would those become a lot simpler in your mind with these large language models, and that may be the first pathway to reduce the need for all the heavy lifting we do in the day-to-day?
Yeah. Let's see, I'm trying to summarize your question. I could use ChatGPT. But the basic things, like getting just the essence out of a large paragraph, that's something they're good at.
Yeah, so maybe I can try to answer the questions.
Yeah, go for it, Weizhu. And Manash
to,
Yes, go ahead.
So one thing actually, I think you talk about very good question is about, okay, for example, when this large language model is becoming more and more powerful, so what do we need to do about the data lake? So in my opinion, it's about data is still the king. You still need a lot of this kind of data lake or something like that to prepare the high quality of the data. Language model actually don't have the observation on your data, especially when your data is the private data. So one of the very important things is about how can you augment your data to make the language model to work for your data instead. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of things here is happening. For example, how can the language model to consume the structured data? That is one. The other one actually maybe in the longer term is about how can we inject more of the structured data into the language model pre-training. So the language model is able to understand better about the structured data. But that's one part. The other part is about how can you make the language model to serve your data much better. This still have the highly dependency on your data. Yeah, data is still very important, I think. Yeah, that is basically my questions, my answers.
Yeah, precisely. plus 100 based on the time we have spent in these models. Data is the king.
Yeah.
Manisha, there were a couple
Yeah.
of other questions in the chat as well. Should we take a few of them, or let us know?
Let me take one from the room, and then we can go to the chat one next. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead. Okay, so your question is around, let's suppose you built your first Copilot or your first prompt flow pipeline. How do you make sure, how do you monitor that it's not deteriorating over time, right? Initially, it's going to be, at least for a year or two, it's going to be a lot of manual oversight. And typically, when it does some task right, it keeps on doing it right. So it doesn't need, but it does need refreshes. And so most of the previous language models for first few years, we would keep an eye on some metric. So you would have to derive the metric. So let's suppose if it's summarizing something, do the certain keywords exist? Or the metric that you would use for a human observation as well. And then make sure that those are still accurate. And when those start going down, then you know that the world facts have changed a little bit, and so it's time to refresh. So it's going to be keeping an eye on the pipeline, making sure in the monitoring section you have the right metrics that are calculated on the nightly actual inferences that happen as well, and setting up triggers on top of that. Coming up with that metric is actually generally the most trickiest part because it's very business specific. So that one is the trickiest part. Okay, let's take a couple from the online one. Yeah. Manish?
Yeah. So there was this question about how to use Azure OpenAI to fine-tune LLM with our own data. Lots of data, some from SharePoint. This question is from Inlay.
Weizhu,
do you want to take?
Yeah.
Or Weizhu.
So in terms of logistics, we can take that one. So logistics is you go to Azure OpenAI, AML, one of the, Manash can help us there. And then give it the data, but exactly how much data to give, what flavor, how much diversity should that be there? Weizhu can chime in on that one.
Yeah, and I'd like to just add that if your data is in AWS, you will have to find a way, use one of Microsoft solutions to bring the data into Azure or the Azure OpenAI service. And yes, the Azure OpenAI service has the capability of training on large sets of data that you provide to fine-tune any of the given particularly the suite of OpenAI models that are available there for fine-tuning.
Yeah. So about the size of the data, yeah, I can share a little bit. It's about, so the size of data is not huge, I won't say, especially for the fine-tuning. There are several kinds of the fine-tuning. For example, supervised fine-tuning, the size of data is pretty small, basically. And when the language model is bigger, the size of the language model is bigger, the requirement for the size of the data actually will become smaller. For example, if you use in the GPT 3.5 to do the fine-tuning, probably maybe a few hundred with the high quality data should be sufficient. And if you use maybe the upcoming GPT-4 to do the fine-tuning, maybe the data will become much smaller. It's also good enough. Because when the model becomes much bigger, actually you have the better capability to do the adaptation. It's much easier for the model to adapt to your data, to adapt to your domain. So the dependency on the size of data will become smaller.
Cool. Yeah. That's actually, that's pretty neat that it's going into hundreds now, not like thousands training them.
Yeah. So because when we dig, and today actually, so in a lot of scenarios, a few hundred is good enough. I think the more important is the quality of the data. The size of the data can become smaller, but the quality of the data matter more. And that's one. The other one actually is about maybe related to this kind of fine tuning or related stuff is the cost to fine tune a model and the cost to serve a fine tune model. This is highly related to, for example, some of the LoRa work we did. We want to reduce the cost to be very, very little. Possibly, maybe in the future, it's almost zero. Yeah.
Cool. Alrighty. The pink shirt.
Hi, Jeremy Lehman. Practically speaking, what's the fine-tuning the model? Feel that prompt can be exhausted, it's time to move on to fine-tuning.
Yes, that's a really good question. Let me repeat it. So what's the signal for when is prompt tuning not sufficient and we should go for fine tuning? So Weizhu, do you want to take this one?
Okay. Yeah, I don't want to say actually you have to choose only one of them. My suggestion is about you always start with the prompt. How can we do the prompt? How can we make the prompt better? And actually, even in the prompt side, there's still a lot of things you're able to fine tune. Even for example, use the RAG. How can you fine tune the retrieval model? So always start with the prompt. But I think on the other hand, it's about when there's also some scenario because how far you can go with the prompt is very, very hard to say. This highly depends on your scenario. And when you are not able to do it with prompt, actually, I think this is right timing to consider the fine tuning. Yeah, and fine tuning is much more adapted to your task. There's also a lot of this kind of good property from the fine tuning. Maybe you can make it much more controllable because you can ask the language model, hey, here is a style I want you to answer, but maybe it's not so easy to do this in the prompt. But I think definitely to start with fine tuning is much more costly and it's much slower, and you also need a lot of expert in your team, yeah, compared to you just do this kind of prompting.
But if your prompt grows to be too big, your inference costs, because the number of tokens are going to grow.
Yes.
So it's something like that's to be figured out, yeah. But like style change, you wouldn't do fine tuning for that.
Yeah.
There are some problems that are just basically suited for prompt. But then if you have like some facts and things, then fine tuning might give you. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think there's also another related question is about maybe share some customer success story about using the fine tuning. Yeah, I think there's some success story, just like responsible AI, just like this kind of the Copilot project I'm working on, GitHub Copilot X. So yeah, I think there's some scenario actually fine tuning can produce much better in the production. Yeah, at this moment. Yeah. For the RAG, definitely RAG is also one of the very active area. I think definitely just like I share, we should always if you want to build something very quickly as the POC or something like that, definitely start with the prompting, including RAG. This kind of the few short RAG, all of them actually belonging to the prompting category.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yes.
Grounding then. Let's take the questions. Yeah.
So in the process of prompt engineering or fine-tuning, do you see us building more richly structured multimodal prompts, either with plugins or automated augmentation of prompts? And if so, how would that best be approached?
Okay. So let me see if I got your question right. You're trying to generate multimodal prompts, so something with the image and text and so what's a good solution, right? What's a good way to design that pipeline? Right now, at least what Kevin showed yesterday is really the most practical way, where you have multiple different models doing different things. For him, he started with speech as the input, so he needed the ASR first, but then get the facts. And so at least the image and the text models so far, because of the cost of them, they are separate. And so there are very few that are generating both the text prompt and the image prompt, and both are right. Though at least one of them is generally off. So I think different steps would be more reliable right now. Okay, so
Sanjay Chopra from Teradata. I wanted to just ask a question line that you thought on where do you start using large language models versus traditional ML? Especially when you start looking at domain models, which are starting to mature and getting good output and getting good results. What's the point where you say, okay, we want to switch over to large language models?
So when you say traditional models, do you mean the classic ML, like forecasting and stuff? Their purposes and the generative models are typically just quite different because the cost of a classical model inference is so manageable that if it can do the job, I feel like just go that route. So like if you wanted to predict what's the next YouTube video you will watch or what next song you would want to hear, you could do more with LLMs, but until the cost gets into literally pennies or nothing, at that point, I think classical will serve you better. At some point when the cost does go very low, then you can generate some interesting things as well, that this person seems to watch this genre and that. And then what do you think should be the next one? But it's not there just quite yet. I think it's there to generate some rich verbiage. But for classic ML, like forecasting problems, I would use forecasting model, at least till now. There is like transformer models happening in that space as well, and that will give you a different kind of depth, but not LLMs, yeah. Oh, and I'm not able to see both the screens, so if you see some hand, like either Manash or Weizhu, please let me know.
Yeah.
Let me take, go ahead.
Question from online.
Oh, 1 second, Manash. Let's take one from the room and we'll take one from online then.
Okay, we can keep alternating, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Oh, good point. I'll repeat the question, yeah. Okay. Let me repeat the question and then I'm going to pass it to Weizhu. So your question was, when do you use RAG versus when do you use fine-tuning? And if you did fine-tune, how do you know that the answer is not coming from base and it's coming from like, what are the chances that the answer would come from base and not the fine-tuned part? Weizhu?
Yeah, so when the first one is when do we use RAG and when do we use fine-tuning? So my suggestion is that always start with RAG and the prompting. Yeah, because it's much easier, you can move much faster, and it's much cheaper, and it's much more, at the beginning, actually, it's controllable, more controllable. You will see, okay, see the impact immediately. So because you don't need to prepare the data, you don't need to do a lot of this kind of the preparation work for the fine-tuning. So that is my quick answer. And the second step, actually, I think we should try to do instead to fine-tune the generative model, large language model, we should try to fine-tune the retrieval model. Try to fine-tune the retrieval model to make the retrieval model to be able to retrieve the right result based on your data. And after that, actually, you can make the generation better. So that is the second step I would suggest. And there's also there are some other things, just like the fusion or this kind of thing, you can also combine together. And by seeing how far this can go, actually highly depends on your application. And because I think basically it's about this kind of the data distribution between your domain and the data distribution in the pre-training. So yeah, if a domain, for example, if you are very generic domain, basically I think maybe this is already good enough because language model based on all data can do pretty well. But it's a very, very specific domain, probably you need to, maybe this kind of the RAG-based approach, maybe it's not good enough. You still need to prepare data to do the fine-tuning. Yeah, fine-tuning, there's still a lot of things to do, just like supervised fine-tuning, reinforcement learning from human feedback, all this kind of thing. And you can also combine together with the prompting together. Yeah, I would love to say. So that maybe is not the first step for the fine-tuning. I would suggest to start with the prompting, including fusion, including RAG, or including a lot of other things, or including fine-tune the retrieval model. That is the first one. The second question, how can you tell whether this generation result is from the original base model or is from the fine-tune model? I want to say that there's a few things here. maybe one is about maybe the you think is the base model. Probably it's already not the base model anymore. It's already a fine-tuned model for the model we're able to access in the API today. So it's just about it's okay. It's about whether you have the further step of the fine-tuning based on your old data. That is the definition probably in my mind. So it's very hard to say. For example, it's just about you can definitely try it. For example, for this prompt and to see okay whether the results are the same or the results are different. Yeah, so that's the way I think for you to test this. Yeah.
And typically, if you have done it fine-tuning for the purposes of a specific task, then you know that's a completely different layer, and it will go through that. And otherwise, if it's just the same task, it typically does give the modified layers higher. Cool. And now let's take one online.
Okay, here's one. The slightly different topic, that's why I picked this one. The question is from Anurag Karuparati. The question is, how will the open source foundation models on Azure ML augment the existing GPT-4 models to make it better? Can you provide an example of a use case? I think this, Manisha, you and Weizhu can add, but this is exactly the scenario that Kevin presented yesterday in his reference Copilot, where he used Whisper, which is an open source model from that you can pull from Hugging Face to do speech to text transcription, which in turn then can be used to go generate summaries from the spoken language, which he then uses in his blog. So that would be an example of chaining models from open source repos like Hugging Face that can then help to augment the power of the end-to-end scenario.
Yeah, like the first one is really the missing one. So if you capabilities that you wouldn't find in the OpenAI model, there is some model augmenting that. And the second one, there might be like as the marketplace grows, there'll be more and more recommendations in a way that, hey, I use this one for this purpose and it does work better. So based on that, like you would pick different models as well. Like some of them might be really small and really fast. Some of them might be powerful. So it's like there are so many blenders. You pick the blender, you read the recommendations.
Yeah. Yes, one thing to add is just like, for example, one example is just like what Manash said is about, for different scenario, you can use the open source model for the speech recognition, another model for this kind of deal with the text, the better understanding, especially for the language. That's one aspect. I think another aspect actually is more like this kind of the hybrid mode. For example, now the open source model at this moment is still a little bit smaller. So there are different kinds of choice. You can pick, okay, 7 billion or 13 billion or 65 billion. So there's some scenario you need to go with the hybrid mode. So it highly depends on how you define the hybrid, how you do the hybrid. The hybrid, you can say about, oh, there's one hybrid is about, okay, for some easy case, I use the open source model to solve that. I use the cheaper model to solve that. A hard case, I use maybe a much more complicated model to solve that because the small model is not able to do that. So that's one kind of hybrid. There's also a lot of other hybrid. For example, just like you can run a model in the local and have the API in the cloud. And you need to have a coordinator to decide, okay, for any of the requests, whether you use the local model and the model in the cloud. So that's another kind of hybrid. So I think there's still a lot of things uncertain at this moment. So how can we combine this better together? Probably I think that is one of the change for the future.
It's an art.
Yeah. I have a practical and potentially nebulous question about operationalizing this stuff. So Sean Stapleton, I'm at MD Anderson Cancer Center. And so we want to consume these types of models, right? And then obviously we've got concerns around security, privacy, compliance, all of this stuff. So we're really interested in understanding what a governance structure looks like. You guys are building models, we're purchasing, products that are built on top of these from other vendors. How do we put together, teams and processes and use the right technology so we understand things are working well? Or, when you guys discover problems, that we can cascade those and figure out how we remediate those internally.
So I think that's where, so let me first of all repeat the question. Using them in a more governance related areas, especially you are from a medical facility, how do you make sure that the data privacy and the security aspects are respected? So that's where a managed platform versus a non-managed platform would make a difference. If Azure ML, just to get to a certain, like Azure ML is right now ring 1. To get to that, it has to demonstrate certain abilities. And data governance is one of it. Security is another one. And there's a huge amount of effort that, in terms of the development costs, it's a pretty big chunk for the product, but it takes that. If another option is doing it in-house completely, then you know it's behind your firewall and you're setting up the rules. So I think that's where you'll have to go for a product that either says we do it, or do it in-house.
Element that I'm thinking here we're really interested in how we understand how we can kind of share governance with all of the different actors in building these products.
Yeah. How do like the shared governance piece where the harm that has happened at the base level, 3 layers down, how do you get informed about it? That part would mature over time. Right now, it's between OpenAI and Microsoft, where anything found, it gets fixed really fast. And that ecosystem would have to be built for the rest of, as it goes into 3P, that would have to happen there as well. Go ahead. And so you're asking about the sustainability of the engineering cost on the development side, right? So let's see. That's, and you guys jump in as well. I think it's, we're all going through this journey together, and you figure out what your business metric is. And typically, most of the time when you start with something, the cost is lower, like your investment level is smaller, and you make sure that there are some early successes. So you only do the attractive features. You hit for the big one. So it's like any other feature development, like feature deployment, where you would have to start small and grow as the revenue grows with that. Go ahead, and then I'll come to you. Yeah.
So it's on fine-tuning again, but now with governance instead. So talk about just the data stored in relation to fine-tuned parameters and the tendency and how that works.
And fine-tuned, yes, and training data and all of that as well, right?
Yeah, so but specifically after you fine-tune, what those parameters, where are they stored?
So a lot of it is stored in customer hobo accounts. So these are hosted on behalf of the customer, but only accessible by that customer. And your question was a governance piece around the artifacts of the fine-tune, so output of the fine-tune. All of that is, in training data is just read. Even if it's copied in the customer hobo storage again. So everything is isolated from the publisher, as well as Azure ML for most parts. Yes, yeah. Cool. So you have been waiting.
So I'm Sudhakar Sundaresan at part 4. Right. So let's say we use a 2.5 or 2. Right. So an earlier version. Do those get maintained just the same way as a later version, and therefore we will have the updates and refreshes like the newest versions? And is there a backward compatibility that we are to worry about?
And you're talking about GPT-2. Okay, so the question was, are GPT series of products also refreshed on a regular cadence so that it has Not that I know of. The models keep going up, and then it has some point releases that might refresh it, but not for the purposes of latest data. So if you ask the model who is the president of US, it would probably answer from the time that it was trained at. So not for the purposes of data, as far as I know, and OpenAI has a booth here. So but you also probably don't want to ask that kind of a question as part of the pipeline. You want to ask that as a one-off question, but not necessarily as a. Also, the latest models are sometimes cheaper than the previous one as well. Weizhu? Yeah.
So the question is about what's the purpose or motivation to migrate to the next version, or?
No,
So I cannot hear the question very clearly from here. Yes.
The question was, the guideline is that if the older model is sufficient for your use case, use it because it's smaller and cheaper.
I see.
So are there any downsides to doing that?
Okay. So I think, yeah, this is because case by case, honestly. But I think for most of the model update, so there's only two things. Probably we're trying to bring in the new model. One is about the quality. So given the same cost, actually, or maybe the same latency or anything else, is the better quality overall. And the second one is the cost. It's just about, for example, just like, okay, given the same quality, how can we reduce the cost? How can we make it much cheaper? So based on these two criteria, definitely, I think for most of the case, you should upgrade to the latest model. Yeah, because we measure the latest model is better in these two aspects. Yeah.
And do you know if the previous models are refreshed? Like, is GPT-2 at this point even 3? Will that be refreshed at a regular cadence?
So the previous model, yeah, I think because how we define the refresh, because refresh is very hard to say about what they call as the refresh. Refresh meaning, okay, yeah, the model is the same and you just change the model with more data, or it's the next version of the model. Yeah, because I don't know what I mean for the refresh. Because for me, actually, I always to think about, okay, to test on the latest model, because I think the principle for the latest model is always come with the better cost or a better quality.
I heard the question of refresh as, let's suppose Wikipedia is one of your training data source in GPT. N. So would it be retrained with the older model architecture, but latest training data?
It is very unlikely, I want to say. Yeah,
I think so too, because it's a small company. Like, there's even our iPhones don't get a refresh.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So can we give the audience the speaker, because we really cannot hear that? Yes.
That's a good idea. Let me see. I'll walk around, and then you can just say the question.
Your hand back to you.
Thank you.
So my question is, let's see, we take one example. I have some domain-specific data which is proprietary, belong to me. I take that data and train, let's say, GPT-4 using the OpenAI API. As the result of that, do I get a GPT-4 Prime? I mean, do I get another version? If I'm getting another version, how can I tell that version is not being accessed by other people other than me?
And you mean fine-tuned, right? Yeah, okay. So you had the question this time, right? Like, so I'll answer the question that it's not accessed by anyone else. When you fine-tune a model, it's your tenant's ownership to that. And no one else has access to it. It goes into your specific registry, and only you have access to it. I mean, your users. So Boeing would have access to it. No one else would have it.
That's the problem I don't want understand. May I have
Sure.
because GPT-4 is such a huge model, right? When you say I have my own instance, does that mean I have a clone of that whole thing? I don't think that's the case.
Yeah, can I take this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So first of all, GPT-4 is not, that isn't an option for you with GPT-4, but we should talk about it in theory with say GPT 3.5. So in Azure OpenAI service, your data is within your tenant and you control it, and it's eyes off for anybody else. That data is then used to fine-tune a GPT 3.5 version, and that fine-tuned checkpoint is only available in your tenant for you to access. So with respect to the fact that the model size is large, yes, it is large, but it is still stored in your storage space or storage space that is attributed to your tenant. And yes, is it inefficient? Yes, perhaps it is inefficient. Then it will really depend on how many different checkpoints you want to maintain. But we would not control nor restrict that storage size for you.
Yeah, so yeah, it's just like what Manash and say is about, you control the access of your model. That's for. And the second one, actually, I would like to add is about your question whether you need to have a duplicated GPT-4 after you do the fine tuning, because that's huge and the cost will be very high, right? You have to do it that way. I think most likely is no, you don't need to have a very duplicated one, because I think if you go to see our work about LoRa, so basically the base model is always the same. It's just about based on your data, we fine tune a LoRa model that is pretty small. And this LoRa model actually, when you do the serving, because it's related to operation, this is how we manage this kind of the inference, and it's very, very cheap. So when you do the serving, so yeah, I think you also hear a lot of things about LoRa in the community. So that's how they make this kind of the, not only the training to be very cheap, it also make the inference to be very cheap as well.
And I'll make it a little bit more real for you. So let's take GPT 3.5 at this point. It has 96 layers, which means there are 96 files with a whole bunch of real numbers and they are all base. So when fine tuning happens, a couple of layers are either modified or a new one is added. Multi-LoRa is trying to separate that as well. So you don't pay the cost for the base model and you only store the modified layers. And in terms of having the access, you have the access for the purposes of inference and not for any other. So you get the access through the service. So at no point would you be able to read OpenAI's IP, which is the model weights. So that access is managed very carefully between the publisher and the subscriber. Yeah.
The important part of code of conduct, when you open the model and people are using it, is there a good way to monitor what people are asking and when it is being rejected or should be rejected, and how to monitor and operationalize that?
So far the use case has been publisher subscriber and not the third party, like levels down, like the products applications built on top of that. But in terms of the logs, the publisher has access to all of the usage logs, that how many queries were, what was the flow, what was the accuracy with respect to, like what was the score. If
you are using plain ChatGPT kind of interface,
mm-hmm.
where you are just calling API and giving response back. In that scenario, how do you monitor?
So I don't know what level of monitoring is out of the box available today. So like the logs are there, and then someone has to build this write reports on top of it. I don't know the exact set of reports, but the data is there.
Because by default, it does not capture the logs also, enable diagnostics.
That's a good.
But yeah, it's not built into.
Yeah. That's a good question to like follow up on as to what does the roadmap look like for those. Go ahead.
I didn't hear the question.
Oh, sorry. Yes. The question was what kind of access to the logs does the publisher have, or if there are applications that are built on top of something, so let's say on ChatGPT, would the person who put in that prompt there, would they have access to how many, how many people used it? Did they get the right answer? Were they happy with it? That kind of a feedback loop for these prompt for pipelines and other things.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay,
Sorry, did you want to add something?
No, I said we can follow up. Yes, got it.
So, sorry again, we really cannot hear the questions. So
Yeah, I'll repeat it. Yeah.
Yes.
Do you envision any kind of encryption, let's say in fine-tuning or any other element that could ensure, access or control of access to the data? Obviously, encryption in the large language model is probably not doable, but maybe in certain portion.
So the question is from the gentleman from Deutsche Bank, where the question is, for the training data, is there encryption mechanisms in place, and what kind of security mechanisms are in place? Right now, for the models are encrypted, but the training data is owned by the tenant itself. Beyond that, you could encrypt it, and some of the banks are also looking at confidential computing as the solution. So there are different things that are being explored, but there's no product offering in that space yet. Oh, is it time? Sorry, I should have been paying attention. So I think if there are no more questions, we can thank you so much. This was a really fun conversation. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.